All right. Welcome, everyone. So this is a workshop for San Diego APCD grants. My name is Ben Wong. We have some grant specialist staff here in the room. This is Nick Cormier. And in the back, so we have our supervisor, Andy Hamilton, and Albert Marr, Heidi Pack, and Robert Mercado. All right. So next slide. Okay, so just going to go over a little bit of the background of our grant program. So just in general, we provide millions to go ahead and replace equipment, well in advance of, regulations. So this funding comes from local and state and federal sources. Just in the fiscal year of 16-17, APCD was able to provide about $3.5 million in incentive funding with lifetime emission reductions of the following: so 183 tons of NOx, 13 tons of ROG, or reactive organic gases, 5 tons of particulate matter. So why should we be cleaning up, or why should we be applying for grants? Basically, it'll reduce the NOx, ROG, and PM emissions. Diminishes the negative effects of increased asthma, respiratory issues, has a positive effect on people who are outdoors or, sensitive people such as children or the elderly. Also, new equipment means reduced exposure to the operators of the equipment. Next slide. And as I mentioned earlier, our incentive programs are voluntary in that we're helping you purchase cleaner than required pieces of equipment or engines, and we need to make sure that these reductions are in surplus of any of the regulations. Right. Okay, next slide, please. All right. So I forgot to mention earlier that I'm going to be just, for the sake of, so what we're doing is we're trying to link this up with a webinar or a webcast, which we will eventually post on our webpage just for better customer service. So if we could, at all possible, hold questions to the end, and then we'll also have any online participants submit their questions, and we'll answer the questions at the end. Okay, so just an overview of some of the incentive programs we have. You guys may be familiar with the Carl Moyer program, but we have an additional few programs that are new to this cycle. So we've got this farmer program, which is basically a program for ag equipment. And we got a community air protection program, which is catered towards communities that are disadvantaged or in low-income communities, essentially sort of like environmental justice communities. We've got some money coming from NOx remediation mitigation. And finally, we have an on-road voucher incentive program designed for small diesel truck fleets. And overall, all of this funding totals to $9.5 million this cycle or this period. Next slide. All right, so just going to quickly go over this Carl Moyer program. These are some of the applicable projects. One thing to note is we are now, through Carl Moyer, we will be offering infrastructure, some funding. So if you're looking to get, natural gas fueling stations put in, or electric charging stations for electric equipment. That is something that we can now offer through Carl Moyer. And so the total amount for Carl Moyer this cycle is about $4.2 million. Just going to briefly go over this, the farmer program. Besides the typical equipment that is applicable through Carl Moyer, there is a new component where ag companies could replace their utility terrain vehicles, or UTVs, with an electric version. And there will be approximately $1.2 million for this program. Next slide, please. All right, so Community Air Protection Program, or CAPP. This kind of ties into Moyer requirements as well, with the caveat of being applicable to projects that are operating in or are based out of disadvantaged communities or low-income communities. That will be defined later in the presentation. One thing to note is that we will be offering some on-road heavy-duty truck grants through CAPP, and however, these grants will be goods movement related, so it'll be very close to GMRP or Prop 1B if you guys are familiar with that. And we'll go over a little bit more of this in the next few slides. And there'll be $3 million available for CAPP. Next slide, please. Okay, so NOx mitigation. This applies to off-road equipment. There'll be about $287,000 available here. Next slide. So the voucher incentive program. So this is catered towards fleets, small diesel fleets of 10 or less. And the main difference between voucher incentive program and all of our other grant programs is that it's a voucher-based program. So you won't have to contract with us, and it's just a more streamlined process. We have about $865,000 available for fiscal year 18-19. Next slide. Okay, so generally the Carl Moyer program is going to be the baseline for all the other programs, in that the requirements of the Carl Moyer program will serve, CAPP, will serve farmer. And one thing that we are doing this year, because infrastructure is a new topic or a new chapter in Carl Moyer guidelines, the 2017 Carl Moyer guidelines, but there is no cost-effectiveness limit for infrastructure projects. So what we're doing is we're allocating $2 million, or we're setting aside $2 million for infrastructure projects to compete against each other. Also, one important thing with the new Carl Moyer program is that co-funding will be allowable. So it is possible to obtain funds from our grants, and also pair it with other funds that you get through other grant programs. Okay, so we're just going to go over some of the minimum eligibilities here. This may be a review if you've ever had a piece of equipment submitted and received funds through Carl Moyer. So basically, the equipment needs to be completed ahead of regulatory compliance 1 to 3 years early, and they must meet the cost-effective limits. These cost-effective limits have changed for the 2017 guidelines. For your typical projects, it's now $30,000 per tons of emission reduced, as opposed to $18,260, and also $100,000 per ton for electric or low NOx projects. And so generally what this means is, the projects that typically have the lower cost effectiveness typically range from projects that use a lot of hours annually and are running off of engines that are your older Tier 0 or Tier 1 engines. And also, as I mentioned, there is no cost-effectiveness limit for infrastructure projects. Next slide, please. Okay, so some more eligibility requirements. With the exception of marine vessels, equipment must operate at least 75% within California and at least 50% within San Diego County. With the exception of certain projects, these projects must be completed by April 30th, 2020. Next slide, please. So for off-road eligibility, so this is dependent on your fleet size and your regulatory compliance. So for large fleets, mainly there are options for funding through Carl Moyer, but there are some restrictions. And so what I've done here is I've just listed the difference between large, medium, small fleets, so you can kind of get an idea, what your fleet size is and how much horsepower you would be able to apply for. And I'm just going to go through the large and medium fleet restrictions. Next slide, please. Okay, so for large fleets that are not meeting the final 2023 fleet compliance requirements, so some of the new requirements here is that, so basically there will be no funding for large off-road fleets after December 31st, 2019. And there is a one-time opportunity for diesel-to-diesel replacement. And this is statewide. So if an agency or company decided to apply up in the Bay Area because they had a lot of equipment up there, if they received that funding, they would not be eligible for diesel-to-diesel replacement after that Moyer funding is received. Also, agencies and companies could only apply to one air district per Moyer year. And if they do decide to go with that one-time diesel-to-diesel replacement, if they're still eligible for Moyer funding, they would only be eligible for zero-emission equipment. Okay, so moving on to medium fleets. Only restriction here really is that there won't be any funding available after December 31st, 2019. So realistically, this Moyer year would be the Moyer year to apply. However, it could be possible to still apply in 2019. It'd just be a very tight time constraint where you would have to receive your new equipment by the end of 2019. Next slide. Okay, so in general, for off-road equipment replacement, new equipment should be Tier 4 final engines, and it would be a like-for-like replacement. So if you had a loader, you would replace it with a similar horsepower loader, and then the existing equipment will be scrapped as part of the program. And what happens is you would purchase it up front after you receive your contract, and then you would scrap the old equipment, and then you would be reimbursed a certain percentage of the funds, which I will, or the cost of the replacement equipment, which I will go ahead and talk about in a little bit. Next slide. Okay. So for off-road equipment replacement projects may be funded up to 80% of eligible costs. And any CAPP-related projects, so these are the projects that are operating in disadvantaged and low-income communities, may receive up to an additional 10% funding. Next slide. Okay, so these are just some information to have ready for your off-road projects. Just equipment information, so your doors, IDs, make, model, serial, engine information, serial numbers, family name, tiers, and basically activity information for the past couple of years. So we want to know how many hours you've operated annually. And also the percentage of operation in California as well as within the county of San Diego. Also, we want to know for the new equipment or the new engine, the make, model, serial number, tier, ARB executive orders, etc. And we want to know how much, these pieces of equipment cost. So we'd like a quote from the dealer that you're looking to purchase from. Next slide, please. So for equipment replacement projects, because we will eventually be dealing with scrapping the old equipment, we would expect ownership records, so bill of sale, as well as a combination of the 2 years of documentation of one of the items listed on the screen. So insurance records, tax depreciation, bank appraisals, that sort of deal. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I'm just going to be talking a little bit about infrastructure projects with relation to Carl Moyer. As I mentioned, this is a new section for the 2017 guidelines. And some of the applicable projects here are essentially non-residential charging or alternative fueling stations, and charging being charging facilities. Stationary irrigation agricultural pump electrification, as well as shoreside electrification for any shore power. Next slide, please. So this is just kind of a funding structure for infrastructure. In general, it's broken down between whether it's accessible to the public or whether it's not accessible to the public. And so in general, all projects would be eligible for up to 50%. Publicly accessible projects up to 60%. And then if we move down to the next tier, projects that incorporate solar or wind power, up to 65% if it's not accessible to the public, and up to 75% if it is accessible to the public. And then also for public school buses, battery charging or alternative fueling stations are eligible for up to 100%. Next slide, please. Also, some additional funding. So if it's a CAPP-related project, it may receive up to an additional 10%. Projects serving a port, rail yard, or freight facility, up to an additional bonus 10%. And then projects at sensitive receptors, which is defined in the CAPP guidelines as of now as schools, hospitals, or daycare centers, up to 100% there. Next slide, please. All right, so because there isn't going to be a cost-effectiveness limit associated with infrastructure projects, we have come up with a rubric, a scoring rubric as to how we would be ranking the different infrastructure projects that we receive through applications. And so these are the criteria that we'd be looking for. Whether the operation of this equipment or this infrastructure is in a disadvantaged, low income, or environmental justice community. We would be looking at the equipment availability. So whether you've already have some kind of alternative fuel equipment or electric equipment owned, and you're just looking to provide infrastructure for that equipment. Whether there's any association with another Moyer application regarding this type of equipment. Public accessibility. Generally expected usage. The more you're planning to use the infrastructure, the higher it would rank. We will be looking into criteria pollutant as well as greenhouse gas cost effectiveness. We'll be also looking into whether you will be using this equipment for zero emission technologies, and also how far along you are in the process of breaking ground and construction on the infrastructure project, or basically the project readiness. Next slide, please. Also, I just wanted to note that for that scoring rubric, it's not, so basically when we release the notice of funding, Nick, what does A stand for again on NOFA? Okay, so once we send out the notice of funding availability document, or the NOFA, that's when we'll have the finalized list for that scoring rubric. Although this is essentially what it may look like. Okay, so some of the documents for infrastructure projects that we'd be looking for in the application process. We'll be looking for quotes and bids, whether you've obtained any necessary permits, land ownership or lease agreement, documentation that sufficient power or fuel is being provided to the site, project timeline, and for shore power projects, an initial terminal plan, as well as a detailed project description. Next slide, please. I'm just going to briefly go over this. So for the farmer program, in terms of off-road ag equipment, it's fairly similar to the Carl Moyer program with the exception of the UTVs. Baseline UTVs must have towing capacity of 600 pounds or greater, and the total vehicle weight must be 700 pounds or greater. Also, the new UTV or the replacement UTV must be electric, and farmer may fund up to 75% of eligible costs. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about marine engine repowers and the eligibility. So existing engines must be 25 horsepower or greater, if applicable in compliance with commercial harbor craft regulation. And new engines must be Tier 3 or Tier 4 marine engines. Next slide. So this is just a list of some of the boats or harbor crafts that are subject to the regulation. Next slide. These are some boats that aren't subject to the commercial harbor craft regulation. And also recreational boats are ineligible for funding. Next slide. So for Tier 3 replacements or Tier 3 repowers, up to 80% is eligible costs. And for Tier 4, up to 85% of eligible costs are eligible for funding. And then CAPP-related projects, may receive an additional 10%, up to additional 10%. Next slide, please. Okay, just going to touch upon locomotive projects. As of now, Class 1 freight railroads are not eligible for Carl Moyer project or Carl Moyer funding if Prop 1B funding is still available. Otherwise, Class 2 and then Class 3, so passenger, military, industrial locomotives would be eligible, and they would be eligible, next slide please, for locomotive replacements, locomotive engine repowers, as well as head-end power unit repowers. Next slide. So the funding is all for Tier 4 engines. Class 1 and 2 locomotives would be eligible for up to 80%, and Class 3 up to 85%, with the possibility of CAPP-related projects being able to receive up to an additional 10%. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about CAPP and on-road projects. So your on-road heavy-duty diesel trucks. The eligibility is fairly similar to Prop 1B, also GMERP program. So they must be compliant with applicable ARB rules, your truck and bus rule, drayage rule, whatever. And they must move commercial goods for sale. And we'd require proof of vehicle ownership and California registration for the past 2 years. Next slide, please. Also, they must operate at least 75% in California for the past 2 years, operate in majority of the time in San Diego County trade corridors, and operate in CAPP-related communities. Next slide. This is just a list of the annual mileage eligibility for existing trucks, just by gross vehicle weight rating or the different class trucks. So we got class 7, 8, 6, and 5. And you'll have this information in your handout to go over. Next slide, please. Okay, so generally the funding for these trucks ranges from $25,000 to $200,000, and we would only be able to fund replacement trucks that are not conventional diesel trucks. So, CNG, hybrid, electric, hybrid with zero emission. These would be the types of trucks that we would be able to replace your old truck with. Next slide, please. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, and maybe Nick would be the better person to talk about this, but I just wanted to briefly touch upon CAPP communities. And so Nick, correct me if I'm wrong. So is it SB 535, which is the disadvantaged communities? Yes. And then AB 1550 is another definition for low-income communities, and there is a map on ARB's website with these locations, so you could determine whether your operation is operating in these areas. And I don't have that map quite available currently, but if you're interested, you could always email or call us, and we could show you where to find that map. Okay. All right. So just a general idea of the grant process. So step one is you submit your application. The APCD staff will go ahead and review your applications and conduct necessary pre-inspections to make sure that the existing equipment is, it is what it is. And then for the complete and eligible projects, these will be ranked based on cost effectiveness as well as whether these projects are in environmental justice communities or whether they operate in CAPP based communities. And then if the project is approved, APCD will begin contracting with the applicant. And next slide, please. And once a contract is signed by both parties, you'll be given a contract number, and then that's when you could start work, begin to order the pieces of equipment. And then once the project is complete, applicants will submit invoice and receipts for reimbursement. We will go ahead and confirm whether the project is complete, it fulfills the requirements of the contract, and this includes post-inspection of the replacement equipment or the infrastructure project. And then the applicant is reimbursed, and the applicant will submit yearly status reports for the length of the contract. Next slide, please. Okay, so just going to talk a little bit about VIP, the Voucher Incentive Program for on-road trucks. So, Nick, your things. So basically, these trucks must be compliant with the truck and bus rule. The fleet must be 1 to 10 vehicles. And the applicable trucks here are class 4 through 8. And also the existing engine model year must be 2009 or older. Operate at least 75% in California for the past couple of years. The company must be based out of San Diego County. And then we'll ask for proof of vehicle ownership and California registration. Next slide, please. So the truck that is going to replace the existing truck must have a engine model year of 2013 or newer. And generally speaking, for the minimum annual mileage for ag trucks is 6,000, whereas non-ag trucks would be 7,000. And this all depends on the age of the truck. And for a more specific table, you would look in Appendix O of the VIP guidelines for 2018. Next slide, please. So these trucks would be eligible for vouchers ranging from 10,000 to 60,000. And so this is a more streamlined process if you have a small fleet, and basically if you're eligible, you would receive a voucher and you would work with one of our approved dealerships and use the voucher to purchase a new truck. Next slide, please. Oh, okay, so this kind of touches on that. This is the process. So first you would contact one of our partnered truck dealerships. The dealership would submit your application on your behalf. Applications are reviewed by APCD staff on unlike the other programs, a first come, first serve basis based on complete applications. So if an applicant is complete, project's eligible, the voucher is issued to the applicant, and the applicant then can go ahead and purchase a new truck using that voucher. Next slide. So this is generally action items to do now. We're expecting to open our application period shortly here, possibly near the end of this month. But one thing to do if you haven't already is to sign up on our grants and incentives listserv, email listserv. And once we do open, you will receive an email letting you know that the online application process is now open. Also, if you've got equipment that you're looking to replace, please go ahead and gather documentation for the past couple of years, 24 months, so hour meters, mileage, usage records. Also, records showing that the equipment operated in California and San Diego County. Next slide, please. You'd gather vehicle engine information, so serial numbers, horsepower, engine families, etc. Make sure that the engines and equipment have legible labels. And then you would meet with vendors or dealers to obtain those quotes for the replacement equipment. And then just be ready to go ahead and submit the application to San Diego. Next slide, please. So this link is in your packet. It's just basically a link to get on our email listserv. And you want to make sure that you go and subscribe under air quality grants and incentives. This is a link to our grants and incentives homepage. Here are some useful links talking about Carl Moyer program, off-road diesel, as well as the truck stop, which is a ARB website for on-road trucks. And then here we have just the contact information for the grants and incentives staff if you ever have any questions. And with that, we can go ahead and open it up to a Q&A. So any questions from the audience here in the room? Okay, so we'll take one here. Yeah, so just out of the structure of doing a webcast, I'm just going to be repeating your question for the audience members as well as the transcript. So to repeat your question, if you are already eligible or you already meet the 2023 final fleet standards for off-road equipment, are you eligible for Carl Moyer funding? And the answer to that is yes. Question in the back. So the question was whether there is a reason between, or the reason for having that requirement that trucks. Okay, Nick, yeah. Yeah. Can you repeat the question?
All right. This is Nick Cormier. So the question is, why is there a specific reason why we're not accepting applications for non-goods movement related on-road projects at this point, or why are we excluding them? And the answer to that is because in the way that the funding was written when it came out from the legislature, it basically said that we had to open up, they used the funding to open up to Prop 1B GMERT projects specifically. They didn't necessarily say you can open that up to one or the other. They just kind of left it at Prop 1B, and the Air District has been implementing Prop 1B for a number of years. So for that special part of the funding of all the funding that we have available, which is the CAPP related funding we're talking about, the $3 million, there is that restriction that it can only be used in a goods movement fashion at this point. But that's not to say that in future years, if we get more money in this program, that could change. It's just the restriction that's on it today. Now we also are thinking about opening up, if we don't get enough applications in this round, we also are thinking about opening up the Moyer program to accept on-road applications that would open it up beyond goods movement related trucks. It's something that we're having some technical issues right now in doing so. It's a new aspect of the Moyer program we have never done before or haven't done in quite a while. So it would be following this current solicitation that we're talking about if it does come open. We've got plans to do it. It's just something we haven't quite been able to do at this point. Hopefully that answered your question. Okay.
Yes, we have a question here. No, so the question is a follow-up question to the previous question, and whether infrastructure projects must fuel goods moving trucks. And the answer to that is no. This essentially, for infrastructure, it must provide either alternative fuel or electricity to projects that are covered under Carl Moyer, the entire Carl Moyer guidelines. So that could include off-road equipment, on-road trucks, and that don't necessarily deal with goods movement, etc. Yes. Yeah, so the question was whether the infrastructure used for charging could be used to charge employees' vehicles, personal vehicles. It's a yeah. There is a light duty passenger vehicle chapter in the Carl Moyer. So I mean, based on that, I would think that may be applicable. Yeah, we'd probably have to look into that some more. Thank you. Question. Okay, so the question was whether we have a period of time where we are going to be accepting applications, and whether we're going to evaluate as we go along, or whether we're going to have all those projects and then evaluate the projects. And so the answer to that is, I mean, in the past, we have opened our application period for 30 days. And we essentially will be evaluating as we go along for, or I guess you could kind of call it like, oh, right. Okay, yeah. So based on that, right, so we would review all the applications we receive before we um, go ahead and contact people, letting them know that we're awarding certain projects. Right. So the question was whether the destruction or the salvaging of um, existing equipment would be costs incurred by the applicant. And the answer to that is yes. Yeah, so the grant would only cover the replacement cost of purchasing either the new engine or the new piece of equipment. But you can also keep the scrap value if that's something that you work out with the scrap vendor. Good question. So the question here was whether an off-road project and an infrastructure project would be submitted as one application or separate applications. And the answer to that is that they will be separate applications. Um, so you can essentially apply for an infrastructure project that supports a off-road project that you're also applying for, or you could just submit an infrastructure project on its own or an off-road project on its own. So the question was whether government fleets would be eligible for funding. Is it off-road fleets or both? Generally speaking, they would be eligible. Um, if so, specifically speaking, if it was an on-road fleet and it was a small fleet, um, I believe it would not be eligible for VIP for the voucher incentive program, in that they're fairly restrictive. So only if you're subject to the truck and bus rule. However, if you're subject to any of the public agency rules, those would not be eligible for VIP. But generally speaking, the government fleets would be applicable or eligible. Yes. So the question is, if you're a government agency, whether they would have to um, uh, receive board approval before applying. Uh, the answer is probably. Yeah, we'd have to look into that. Any other? Um, Do you want to clarify that?
Okay, so we're just clarifying the question that if you're a public authority, if you need a board resolution to apply for this grant, and the answer that we know at this point is we are urging people to apply, if we need a board resolution from your respective agency, we may require that prior to contracting. But in terms of accepting an application on APCD's end, it would not be required.
Any other questions from the room? Yes, sir. So the question was whether we have established a date for the application period to open, and the answer to that is it's mixed. So currently we are working with our IT vendor to upgrade our online application process. So, I mean, we're looking for a date in June, but we don't know what that exact date is. It'd probably be near the end of June is what we're expecting. But we would encourage you to go ahead and sign up for our listserv, and that way you would be in the know once we do open. Right. So the follow-up question was, yes. So the application period generally is for 1 month. Jack? Okay.
So the question is, how has this funding changed or possibly incentivizing more projects in relation to AB 617? It's primarily the CAPP funding that you heard about today, that while it's not a specific tie-in to AB 617, was passed separately to incentivize the types of projects that AB 617 is wanting to do. And if people are unfamiliar with AB 617, it's a pretty significant piece of air quality legislation that's going to require air districts, the Air Resources Board, to focus on areas that are what they're quantifying as disadvantaged communities. And there's a few communities that we have identified at APCD that we submitted to ARB as of the end of April, that using a variety of factors, there's at least 2 that we're hoping to include in that those selected communities at this point. There could be we have an additional 4 that could be included at some point in the future. We have the ability to kind of spend that CAP money, and that CAP money will be focused in those disadvantaged communities. So there is a significant, we received almost double the amount of money because of that, but we will have to use a lot of that money in those communities, such as some of the examples are Barrio Logan, San Isidro, El Cajon, those communities that we identified in our April 30th submittal. Is that answered? Okay.
And we had a question back there. So the question was whether the VIP program versus the other grant programs was different in terms of going through whether it's first come first serve or not. So right, so the VIP program is designed a little differently from the other programs. The other programs will be we'll take all the projects and we'll evaluate all the projects, and they'll be ranked based on cost effectiveness primarily. Whereas with the VIP program, what we're expecting is we'll be evaluating projects as they come in, and we will be looking for complete applications, complete and eligible applications. So if applicants or applications are incomplete, we may go back and say, hey, this is incomplete, and then we would move on to the next application to review, and so on and so forth until either the funding is exhausted or the period has ended. Does that answer your question? Yes. Yes, so the question is if you have multiple pieces of off-road equipment, would that be one application versus multiple applications? And so it would be 6 separate applications. But so yeah, so it looks like you might be able to clone some records, but you would have to submit 6 multiple applications. Yes. So the question. So you're interested in an off-road replacement and specifically a propane option? What kind of equipment is it? Robert, are you talking about um, the propane engine? Right. Okay. So to summarize the answer, so it is possible to go from diesel to propane if that equipment is available. And I did hear from ARB about this situation, and it would require that both obviously your off-road diesel fleet as well as your off-road large spark ignition fleet both be in compliance. So it is a little tricky, but it could be possible. Any more questions in the room? Yes, so the question is where can applicants or potential applicants find the 2017 Carl Moyer guidelines? And we have a link on it. Yeah, you can look that up real easily, and you could always give us a call, and we could send you a direct link. Are there any questions online? Okay. Okay. And so the question is, could applicants apply for partial funding for an infrastructure project? So maybe you can help clarify what do you mean by applying for partial funding? Yes, so the clarification is that there are multiple phases to a CNG refueling station project, and yes, I believe you can apply for expansion.
So we're just trying. The question was trying to figure out if an infrastructure project, if it was already in process, or if there was multiple phases, could we fund phase 3 and 4 as an example? And the answer would be, as we know, that as long as the infrastructure equipment hasn't been ordered or outright purchased, then it should be eligible for an application under Carl Moyer. Um, Even if it has been ordered, it's kind of at your own risk, but we urge people not to order any of the equipment until the application has been submitted and that you're under contract with the district, which occurs a couple months afterwards.
All right, one more? Yeah, so that's a good question. So the question was, what are the typical contract lengths for off-road projects? And basically, it would vary on what kind of piece of equipment it is. But generally speaking, probably around 3 to 5 years is the contract length. Robert, is that about right? The question was about contract project life for off-road equipment. Yes, so it would depend on the type of equipment, 3 to 5 years. The doors reporting. Yeah. So that would be in addition. So the doors reporting would be for ARB, and then this reporting, which is essentially just looking at the hour meter and letting us know how many hours you ran and what the equipment serial is. That would be sent to us. Any final questions here? No questions online? Okay. All right. So with that, we'll wrap up this workshop. We'll probably be around for maybe 15 more minutes or so. So if you have any lingering questions, feel free to stick around. Otherwise, thank you all for attending.